Welcome to Funny Reading of Classics. My name is John.H.Watson, and I'm the narrator of this video. Today, we will continue the thrilling story of a scandal in Bohemia. First, let us briefly recap the previous events. His Majesty, the King of Bohemia, came to visit Sherlock Holmes, seeking his extraordinary abilities to retrieve a photograph from the woman named Irene Adler. And then, we will unveil the new chapter of this captivating story. This part consists of 3 chapters, and the first chapter is titled The Advanced Preparations. Now, let's dive straight into the story. As our hands clasped together, Holmes seemed to let out a sigh of relief and smiled.
I was sure that I might rely on you.
But what is it you wish? Holmes took a long cigar-shaped roll from his pocket to me.
Once the operation begins, you will stand by the window in the target's living room. I will work to get into the sitting room and have them open the window. Your job will be to ensure that I remain within your line of sight. And when I raise my hand, you will throw it into the room, and will, at the same time, raise the cry of fire. You quite follow me?
Entirely, but what is it? I glanced at the peculiar object in my hand, and couldn't help but ask.
It is an ordinary plumber's smoke rocket, fitted with a cap at either end to make it self-lighting. Your task is confined to that. You may then walk to the end of the street, and I will rejoin you in 10 minutes.
I nodded, but it seemed that Holmes anticipated my nature, so he added.
There is only one point on which I must insist. There will probably be some small unpleasantness. You must not interfere, come what may.
I know Sherlock Holmes well enough to understand that when he says something like this, he's likely planning to do something less than ethical. Nevertheless, I gave him my solemn promise. You may entirely rely on me.
That is excellent.
Holmes smiled, and his expression seemed to convey not only the relief of having my cooperation, but also a hidden gratitude for my complete trust in him.
I think, perhaps, it is almost time that I prepare for the new role I have to play.
Then he disappeared into his bedroom, and returned in a few minutes in the character of an amiable and simple-minded nonconformist clergyman.
Now that all preparations are complete, it's time to move to the scene of action.
As I stood in awe of his superb disguise skills, he smiled and guided me into the cab that had been prepared in advance. When we arrived at the Bryony Lodge, its occupant had not yet appeared, so we paced up and down nearby to pass the time. I noticed that the area was not as secluded and serene as I had imagined. A variety of people were gathered there, shabbily dressed men, artisans, guardsmen, nurses, and several well-dressed young men. It was an animated mix, especially for such a quiet neighborhood. I even glanced at Holmes with suspicion, wondering if he had orchestrated this. Noticing my gaze, Holmes merely smiled without offering any explanation. Instead, he turned his head to the house.
Now the question is, where are we to find the photograph?
Where? I knew he was changing the subject, but I was indeed curious about how he would proceed.
Well, from what we currently understand, she is a cautious and astute woman. So after 2 attempts on her belongings, she does not carry the photo about with her. I considered whether she might secret it with someone she trusts most, but just as the king personally came to meet with us, the photo is too important. With the king's impending marriage, she would certainly keep the photo in a place where she can lay her hands upon it, which means it must be somewhere in her own house.
His deduction was certainly reasonable, but considering that the photo had twice been burgled, wouldn't they have thought of targeting this house? Holmes's answer to this, however, was even more perplexing to me.
I will get her to show me.
I found it hard to imagine under what circumstances a lady would display such an important item in front of her greatest enemy. However, my thoughts were interrupted by the rumble of wheels. Irene Adler had returned. At the moment she has arrived, we now transition into the second chapter, titled The Critical Moment.
Now carry out my orders to the letter.
Holmes gave me a quick instruction, and then turned to leave. I quickly moved to the pre-arranged spot and prepared to observe everything that was about to happen. Everything was normal on the street until the woman was about to get off the landau, when the situation changed suddenly. Several loafing men at the corner dashed forward to open the door in the hope of earning a copper, but was elbowed away by other loafers. This led to more idle people joining in, and the initial quarrel quickly escalated into a fierce blow, with everyone gathered on the street getting involved in the chaotic argument. I watched in astonishment as the chaos unfolded, and at that moment Sherlock Holmes sprang into action. As the lady was caught in the center of a little knot of flushed and struggling men, Holmes dashed into the crowd, seemingly aiming to protect her. However, just as he reached her, he gave a cry and dropped to the ground, was left blooded and dazed, with the blood running freely down his face. At his fall, the chaos immediately ceased. The previously enraged crowd quickly dispersed, leaving only a number of better-dressed people to assist Miss Adler in carrying the apparently unconscious and wounded Holmes into Briony Lodge and laid out in the principal room. I still observed the proceedings from my post by the window and reflected on the earlier events, unable to suppress a quiet chuckle. I hadn't anticipated my companion using such an ingenious method to infiltrate the house. I didn't personally know the character of Irene Adler. My understanding of her was limited to the verbal descriptions from the King and Holmes. However, I know that I never felt more heartily ashamed of myself in my life than when I saw the beautiful creature against whom I was conspiring, or the grace and kindliness with which she waited upon the injured man. And yet it would be the blackest treachery to Holmes to draw back now from the part which he had entrusted to me. I hardened my heart and took the smoke rocket from under my ulster. We are not injuring her. We are but preventing her from injuring another. With that thought in mind, when Holmes raised his hand as a signal, I tossed my rocket into the room with a cry of fire. Immediately, similar cries echoed from all directions, and everything unfolded just as Holmes had planned. 10 minutes later, Holmes joined me as planned. Once we reached a quiet street, I couldn't help but ask him about the progress of the operation. You have the photograph?
I know where it is.
And how did you find out?
She showed me, as I told you she would.
Seeing that I still didn't understand, Holmes smiled, looking quite pleased with himself.
When a woman thinks that her house is on fire, her instinct is at once to rush to the thing which she values most. It is a perfectly overpowering impulse. Now it was clear to us that Our Lady of today had nothing in the house more precious to her than what we are in quest of.
I immediately understood what Sherlock Holmes meant. His entire plan for the evening was designed to shake Miss Adler's composure, causing her to reveal the location of the photograph voluntarily.
The alarm of fire was admirably done. The smoke and shouting were enough to shake nerves of steel.
With Holmes's triumphant appearance, I couldn't help but wonder, if a woman who could leave even a king feeling helpless was bested by him, what kind of woman could possibly thwart him?
Our quest is practically finished. I shall call with the king tomorrow, and with you, if you care to come with us.
We had just arranged the details for the next day's plan, and were stopping at the door of Baker Street when someone passing said,
"Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes."
Holmes was momentarily stunned, and as he snapped back to reality and looked at the passer-by, he could only discern that the greeting appeared to come from a slim youth in an ulster who had hurried by. Even with my deep understanding of Holmes, I had never seen him exhibit such a reaction. It was as if something had completely caught him off guard and shocked him. But could something like this really happen to Sherlock Holmes?
I've heard that voice before. and now, I wonder who the deuce that could have been.
Holmes staring down the dimly lit street. His tone carried a hint of disbelief and self-doubt. Tomorrow we will face the woman, Irene Adler, in a showdown. I was filled with curiosity about what action Sherlock Holmes would take next. Now, let's delve into the third chapter, Final Reward of Sherlock Holmes. Since I had been involved in the case up to this point, I naturally did not want to miss its conclusion, so I slept at Baker Street that night. The next day, after the King of Bohemia had arrived, we went to the Briony Lodge together.
Married. How could she fall in love with someone other than me?
In the carriage, as the King listened to Holmes's verbal report, he could not help but exclaim in surprise upon hearing the news that Irene Adler had already married.
I am in hopes that she does.
The expression of Sherlock Holmes remained calm.
And why in hopes?
The King was clearly puzzled.
Because it would spare your Majesty all fear of future annoyance. If the lady loves her husband, she does not love your Majesty. If she does not love your Majesty, there is no reason why she should interfere with your Majesty's plan.
It is true, and yet. Well, I wish she had been of my own station. What a queen she would have made.
The conversation ended there, and we soon arrived at our destination, only to be greeted an elderly woman with a sardonic eye.
Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I believe? My mistress told me that you were likely to call. She left this morning with her husband by the 5:15 train from Charing Cross for the continent.
What? Do you mean that she has left England?
Sherlock Holmes staggered back, white with chagrin. For some reason, I had the feeling that Sherlock Holmes didn't seem particularly surprised. As the maid mentioned, the house was in complete disarray, with everything taken, including the photograph that His Majesty valued most. Irene Adler left us only a letter addressed to Holmes and a photograph of herself.
You really did it very well. You took me in completely.
At the beginning of the letter, Irene Adler confessed that she had not suspected Holmes' disguise until the alarm of fire, even though she had received word that Holmes would act as the King's agent and had prepared for it in advance. Even so, she still lost to Holmes, which made her realize how formidable an antagonist she was up against. So, after disguising herself and following us back to Baker Street, where she wished us good night, she left London overnight with her new husband. The description in the letter confirmed for me that the slim youth who had made Holmes so uneasy yesterday was, in fact, Irene Adler. As for our client, the document he cared about most, Irene Adler also gave her promise regarding it.
As to the photograph, your client may rest in peace. I love and am loved by a better man than he. The King may do what he will without hindrance from one whom he has cruelly wronged. I keep it only to safeguard myself, and to preserve a weapon which will always secure me from any steps which he might take in the future.
Here's the full content of the letter. At this point, I couldn't help but reflect on what an extraordinary and intelligent woman Irene Adler was. Although she had once been deceived by Holmes, her response had left even the most brilliant detective I knew and a king in prolonged silence. This case comes to a close here, though I'm not certain if it has been fully resolved. For the king, the crucial photograph is now safe. For Holmes, however, this resolution hardly constitutes a victory. As a result, he did not accept any reward from the king, instead taking only the photograph left by Irene Adler back to Baker Street. In the remaining years of my acquaintance with Holmes, the photograph of Irene Adler in evening dress remained on his desk, seemingly becoming a symbol of sorts. I did not know what Holmes thought of her, but there was no doubt that the man who used to make merry over the cleverness of women had not done so lately. And when he speaks of Irene Adler, or when he refers to her photograph, it is always under the honourable title of the woman. This was how a great scandal threatened to affect the kingdom of Bohemia, and how the best plans of Mr. Sherlock Holmes were beaten by a woman's wit. I hope my description has conveyed the charm of this story to you. Until the next story, see you then.